everybody. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Asian Perspectives panel on today's climate, promoting community change and unity. I am Dr. Debra, and I am the director and founder and everything with my co-person, Akil Bashir, who's not quite here yet, of the Script Conference. And this is our pre-conference because our big conference, July 16th and 17th, and it will be on Zoom, and you can still register at Eventbrite. So please go to our Script page and you can find out all that information. And Christina will also put it in the chat for us. But today we have a great panel to talk about some of the wonderful things that are happening in our climate, but some of the things that we also need to discuss and work out because we need to create change. And this year's theme is leadership and change. So what a great time to have this discussion. And we have a wonderful panel of people. We have Eric Kung, Blake Chow, Jorge Wong, and Cindy Gao. And Today's abstract is, due to current life circumstances, there has been a substantial increase in discrimination towards Asian communities. This panel will discuss the topic pertaining to discriminatory behavior, stereotypes, and ways to promote change while embracing the Asian community. And then we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. But before we do that, just so that we are all on the same page, please mute your microphones because you will have a Q&A at the end. Please also utilize the chat if you want to ask questions. Captain Young will be monitoring that and also be sending those questions to me. You can also use the raise your hand feature if you want to say something. Christina, please demonstrate that for me. But we will definitely be looking in the chat and making sure that we get your questions answered at the end. So with no further ado, let's introduce our wonderful panel. The panel will have 2 minutes to introduce themselves to you. So let's start with Blake Chow.
Thank you, Doctor, and good evening, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here and such an important topic. My name is Blake Chow. I'm a deputy chief at LAPD. I've been on for a tad over 30 years, but I really wanted to kind of introduce myself more from a personal perspective because the topic is so important, and I think each one of us brings to the table a different perspective, different experiences growing up growing up AAPI in this society, and kind of led us to where we are right now. So my brother and I grew up in San Jose, California. I won't go into the year, but let's say it was in the 1970s. But back then, really, my family came here in 1910 from the southern part of China. My grandmother took a steamship over here. It took her 4 weeks to get here. They ended up becoming farmers in the Sacramento Valley. They had 8 kids. And really back then, really the whole goal was to almost leave your culture behind and assimilate into American culture. That's really, I think, what my grandparents pushed upon my parents, and certainly what my parents pushed upon my brother and I. So unfortunately, when we were growing up, being, Chinese in, a predominantly Caucasian area, my mother was a teacher and my father was an engineer. My brother and I were the subject of things now that would be considered hate incidents and hate crimes. But, back then, again, we were, our whole goal was really to kind of assimilate into culture. And, we kind of laughed it off, and it was just part of growing up. So then when I became college age, I had an interest in going into law enforcement. But again, my parents didn't want me to go into something that wasn't your traditional Asian profession, something very professional. They didn't look at law enforcement as a profession. And soon I found out that I probably wasn't smart enough to be a doctor. So I majored in business, and I graduated from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo with a degree in business. So my first job was actually, I was an internal auditor with a company called Raytheon in Santa Barbara, and I hated it. So I joined the San Jose Police Reserves, and I started enjoying this profession more than what I was getting paid for. And I started looking around, and Los Angeles happened to be hiring. So I applied, and I was hired by Los Angeles. So even when I came to Los Angeles, and I actually worked for Captain Young when she was a brand new sergeant, we didn't have any Asian command staff officers on the LAPD in 1990, if you can imagine that. It wasn't really that long ago. It wasn't until the last 20 years where you started seeing a lot of the AAPI being promoted into leadership positions in this organization. But a lot of it had to do with the fact, if you talk to a lot of the individuals that were around at the time, there was a stereotype that existed in our organization in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s that Asians didn't want positions of responsibility. They were happy being detectives or whatnot. So as we came up through the ranks, that is one of the things that I feel that we had to change, which I believe that we have, because we have several Asian command officers that are up in the higher echelons. So I believe each one of us, again, has a story, and each one of us has a responsibility to model ourselves for the AAPI community and also the rest of society, to kind of disprove some of these myths that we had to grow up with when we were younger.
Thank you. Who wants to go next and introduce themselves?
Go.
All right.
So my name is Eric Kung. I'm a psychologist, but I guess I'll go the route of Chief Chow and do a more personal intro. So I'm what you would consider second generation, meaning I was born here and my parents were immigrants. They both immigrated here as students from Asia. My father actually, in the 50s was fleeing communism back during the whole cultural shift over there. They both came here as students, kind of did the whole American dream thing, and got educations here, both became engineers, bought a house, had 2.5 kids, the whole bit. And here I am. So I grew up in the LA County area my entire life, and I'm still here. So I grew up here in like the 80s and 90s. So again, very similar, unfortunately, to Chief Chow. A lot of things were happening to the API community at that time, which would for sure be, considered hate crimes, just on like a, pretty regular basis. But at the time, it was just normal way of living up. You kind of just kept your head down, did what you had to do, and move on. There wasn't that awareness that these were really, really, really bad things happening, very racist, very hateful things. So, thankfully things are a lot better now, but we definitely have a lot of work to go. So I'm really glad we're doing something like this where we can kind of have an open dialogue about what's been going on. And that's me.
How about Miss Cindy?
Hi, so I'm Dr. Cindy Gao. I am a licensed professional clinical counselor, and currently I'm working at a group practice called Women's Inner Fitness. I'm licensed in a couple of different states, Maryland, Oklahoma, registered in Florida. A little bit of just kind of personal stuff too. So I'm also a second generation Taiwanese American. Grew up in the 80s and 90s in the Metro DC area, so a little bit of a different flavor from some of the folks that are here. In a way, the area I grew up in, there was a large Taiwanese presence. So I grew up around being, the right thing to do was you go to Chinese school on Sundays, you're supposed to do various kind of go through the motions of cultural things. But I don't think I ever really grasped what that meant when I was little. And much of what's echoed here, I can remember like really early memories in preschool, like being 4 and 5, and having what I would now understand to be microaggressions. I knew at the time what was being said made me feel like I was wrong, or there was something bad that I had said about something I ate or something that I did with my family, and I just remember these moments. And it's like snapshots, like we discussed, this idea that it is the cumulative nature of our own experiences and those things that form the lens of how we understand the world, of how people experience us, but also how we begin to experience ourselves. Growing up in the Metro DC area, which is pretty diverse, going to college in a very predominantly white university down in Southern Virginia was a huge culture shock for me. And having even more blatant experiences. So, we're into the 2000s now, right? Like blatant experiences of racism and stronger forms of microaggression, comments that people would say, oh, are your feet small because they bound them? And I'm like, aren't you in college? Shouldn't you know that that's not a thing? And then realizing, oh no, that's a thing because you're making a racist comment about me because you don't know. kind of constantly that framed my experience, even when it came to dating, people making comments meaning to be well-meaning in terms of, oh, you remind me of such and such, you know, an Asian actress or something like that, and the various tropes of those things that frame your existence. And being an Asian American woman that is pretty straightforward, pretty opinionated, pretty outspoken, and having that go against the grain of various expectations, excuse me, in our society. And having those experiences framed and mirrored as I taught at the undergraduate and graduate level, as I experienced life outside of DC, Virginia, living in Middle America, living in Middle America, living in California, living overseas, and having those experiences framed within all of these different lenses.
And Mr. Wong.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Jorge Wang. I'm a clinical psychologist, and thank you again for spending your time with us. I'm not sure if I'll do justice, but I'll try to follow what you guys, what Chief Chow was actually said. I'm of Chinese descent, but I think my path coming here is quite different. I actually was born in Cuba, so part of me growing up was being very trying to be Latino or Hispanic. And at the time I was growing up, it was interesting because as I was growing up, Hispanic was the preferred term, and Latinos were always looked upon as they're Mexicans, and those were the people that we would see on TV. So they were like the Latinos, and then everybody else was Hispanic. So growing up in Cuba, I think we were one of the very few families that actually had kids grown up there. So discrimination and racism was rampant. It wasn't really about a black and white thing, but it was everything else but that was different from the Cuban culture. So in that sense, I was always seen as like an oddball, in particular in school. Sometimes it could have been like maybe 3 Asian or Chinese students, but oftentimes it would have been just me in school. As my family immigrated to the United States, one of the things I remember was we landed in San Francisco, and that's where I grew up at night. And then the next day, my uncle or my mother's maternal, her brother took us out to dim sum. And I remember looking at my sister and saying, oh my God, there's so many Chinese people here. And it was like the weirdest experience because I've never seen that many Chinese people. So learning to be Chinese when the first maybe like 12 years of my life, I was trying to be Cuban, and then trying to integrate this new identity as everybody called Asian Americans, was actually led me to be in a very kind of interesting intersectionality of identities. I don't quite identify 100% with one or the others, but I'm able to also then kind of shift and go in between. And sometimes that has been a very useful way of looking at how things are presented or challenges. But at other times it's also been quite challenging because no one wants to kind of claim that I'm part of that group. As I grew up, and as Chief Chow had said, is like I was told I needed to be 3 things: a business person, a doctor, or a computer programmer, all of which I really hated. Having grown up in Cuba, I always liked sports, so I played a lot of sports, and ultimately I flunked out of college. And this was at a time when UC Santa Cruz did not have any grades. So can you just imagine somebody flunking out of college and not actually getting grades? But interestingly enough, nowadays when I present myself as a professional, everybody respects me because of the degree and some of the things I've done. They're very surprised that I tell them that, you know, I had to find my own way. And it wasn't like the model minority way, as most people think, and also don't identify 100% with one group or the other. So I bring that kind of a perspective to the discussion. And I also wanted to point out like the whole idea of like leadership. Oftentimes people don't see Asians in leadership positions because oftentimes we're too quiet, or, you know, we're much more the doers, the behind the scene. And one of the things I was encouraged to do at one point was to run for the California Psychological Association president, which I did. It was interesting to me that the times that I decided to run, I always had a competitor. But the 3 people prior to me, they run unopposed. So I'm thinking, that's kind of interesting. Is it really about having someone run against somebody else? Or looking back, I think there's a lot of implicit biases in regards to even within a profession that tries to address a lot of discrimination and social justice issues. So anyways, I'll stop there and I'll try to bring some of my perspective into the discussion because I think there's a lot more questions to cover. So thank you again for being here and inviting me.
And thank you so much for my wonderful panel for coming. So we're going to dive into the questions, and you'll hear me call a lot of the panelists by their first name because here at Script, we do not like to use the titles as much so that everybody feels included in this, so it doesn't distance that we're all a community working together. So the first question I'm going to throw out there for the panel is, reflecting on today's society, what key events have had the most reflection on you? So reflection on right now in today's society, what key events have had the most reflection on you?
Doctor, I can go if you like.
Go ahead.
Okay. You know, actually, it was actually COVID for me. As COVID kind of became more of a you know, a news media item, and you know, it kind of became more serious during the year that it kind of spread in the U.S. A lot of the rhetoric that was going on the internet and with some politicians, quite frankly, in trying to tie this virus to a particular country, and the backlash that I saw against people that were perceived as from that country was really quite astounding to me. I had thought, quite honestly, you know, I had thought that some of the things that I had experienced when I was a child or when I was growing up actually were things of the past, because you would think that 40 years later, society's become a little more sophisticated. But when COVID hit, I think we realized that that probably was not true. And I think that social media kind of exacerbated the problem. But what it did underscore, and what I've seen lately, especially with some of the things that have happened in the AAPI community, that they've become rallying points for many AAPI groups that are coming together now and trying to do something or taking a stand and sending a message that, you know, that type of perception, that type of hate crime, hate incidents, those types of things are not acceptable. And there are a lot of people coming together that before COVID occurred, I don't think we had that unity in the AAPI community to really take a stand and try to solve the problem.
Can I jump in, Debra? I was going to echo a little bit of this as well. I didn't share this at the start, but my husband is military, and that of course adds a whole nother layer to all of my other experiences as well. And we were looking at a posting in Asia. So we were watching the news very closely in terms of what was happening. So basically in December, when the cases started happening, we were watching the news. We also have family in Asia that were, you know, sending us news and keeping us informed. And I remember vividly going to maybe a dinner party. We were in the DC area, and I think it was like January or something. And I said, oh, you know, because we're concerned about coronavirus and what's going to happen when we move. And literally people were saying, what coronavirus? And I remember, like, what is that? Oh, that's not going to be a thing. And not only that, but sort of we were paying attention to something. I mean, of course, because of our experience, but also that this was something that was going to be a concern. And I remember even in my family, when we had family that was going to be flying in the springtime, right before the shutdown, you know, in February, we realized that this was something that was happening, and being concerned, about, well, we know that this is potentially airborne, but if we wear a mask when we travel, people are going to assume that we have this virus or we have this infection or whatever, and we will be perceived or experienced in such a way. And I feel like this is a little bit of that flavor of it, not to say that coronavirus was the only trigger point. As I mentioned in my introduction, I have known that being AAPI has been part of my life story since the time that I basically had cognizant ability to know that I was not like everyone else. However, it was sort of that beginning, that planting of the seed that basically echoed other experiences that I had been taught and raised with of, hey, you don't look like everybody else. Hey, people watch you. Hey, the things you do are important. How you present yourself is important. And that set off that roller coaster. And then for me, the other big point was when the race riots and protests were happening in the summer. As a as a clinician too, I'm trying to hold the space for my patients and my clients that are talking about all the things that are coming up within themselves. And me, myself, we're living in this real time, right? So I am a human too that feels these things and is thinking about these things and thinking about my own experiences and thinking about prejudice and race and all of these things. And it was just a reflection moment. I remember it was like it was churning inside me. I was talking about it all the time. I was talking about it with my family. And this is like quarantine, right? So we're here with our families attempting to work remotely, but also trying to take care of our babies and trying to live and survive, but also having this active discussion, actively having those connection points with my family about, okay, what is happening? How does this relate to things that are different? How does this relate to us? And then of course, with the shootings that happened in Atlanta, it was like everything was kind of building up, and of course framed within my own experiences of, yes, it's not me, but how does this difference still reflect in my experiences as well?
Yeah, COVID has had a huge impact on a lot of things and perceptions and how people are behaving right now in society. And it is quite scary because it's brought a lot of stuff to the surface that was already there. Now people are looking at it. And I mean, I'm going to let Jorge talk about that, but I just wanted to make that comment because I think that that's why a lot of stuff is happening now, that we are able to discuss this and have this kind of panel, but it's also, I mean, for me, it's kind of scary, you know?
Yeah. I think for me, COVID was like a pivotal point, but one of the things I've been reflecting for quite a while is as the last few years with a different kind of a leadership in the country, there's a lot of tension. And I noticed that each group was actually targeted at a certain particular time. And even though when I was watching colleagues, friends from the API community, there was some support for, like, say, like the Black Lives Matter, but it was quite interesting to me to see that when it actually the violence was targeted towards the AAPI community, everybody seems to coalesce much more. And in that sense, their support for all the other injustices that have been happening actually became much more real, not only in the local AAPI media, but also in discussions, and even the academics all jumped in. I think one of the things I always wonder is like, how much can we really empathize or really feel, understand what somebody else is going through unless it actually happens to us? And likewise, when there was like a huge number of assaults on older individuals. And I think one of the things that crossed my mind at that point was like, this has actually happened a lot, and particularly during a lot of festivities, like during Lunar New Year's. I've always been in communities where there's a large Asian or particularly Chinese or those who kind of celebrate the Lunar New Year. And people know that oftentimes these senior citizens carry cash upon them. So the violence was not so foreign to me, except that now with the advent of social media, the smartphones, it was actually being documented. And I was very surprised that that actually took quite a bit of a steam in regards to sharing some of the things that are happening to a community that really isn't really talking much about some of the things that happens to them, with the understanding that culturally speaking, they also are very much taught, or at least we were always taught from the very young age, to tolerate and just take it and kind of try to bypass and kind of work around things rather than really confronting it. But I'm also very surprised to see that in these times, many of the younger generation that are a little bit more, I would say, accustomed to what the system here is like, are willing to speak up and are willing to really show proof and also bring to life and bring it to our existence of what is really happening around our world. So in that sense, I think COVID did trigger much of that, but I've also been watching for several years and quite, interested in how the API community reacted when the focus was upon them. So.
Anyone want to comment on anything said before we move on to the next question?
I'll go really quick.
Eric?
Yeah. So I guess I'll end on a more positive note. So like you guys have all kind of mentioned, this has been boiling under the surface for years now. It's not just a new thing. It's kind of been maybe hidden, and lately it's been more out in the open. But I guess one of the more positive things is that, like Jorge was saying, the reaction of the community is very, very different than it was maybe 30 years ago. 30 years ago, if this was happening, we would have just felt like been told, just, sit down, shut up, keep going, tolerate, just let it go. Don't make waves, that kind of thing. Whereas this time around, you see a lot of, kind of fighting back, right? On a local and a national level, where people are speaking up, saying something. I think, like Jorge said, technology has a lot to do with that, because now you can see exactly what's going on. People have little cell phones, they're going around recording, and people are not tolerating that anymore like they would have 30 years ago. So locally, nationally, the communities are getting together, defending themselves, and even on a national level, like, our government is so divided, but this is one of the few things they're able to agree on, is that, hey, we're going to pass legislation to help the Asian community. And it's just really amazing to see within the last, 20, 30 years, how different we're reacting to this. Like, now we feel like, yeah, we're not going to tolerate this. We're going to do something about that. So at least that's been something positive to come out of all this.
Can I say just a follow-up to what Eric has mentioned? I think in the past, many of the times that I've noticed that depending on which group or which cultural group or ethnic group of Asians were being targeted, it was interesting to me to see that other groups, it's not us, it's them. But in this time, because of the virus, everybody confused everybody to being Chinese. So somehow many more Asians actually were impacted. And it was surprising to me to see them all coalesce together, when, historically speaking, there's a lot of conflicts even amongst the diversity of all the Asian groups that we see. So that to me was quite interesting, how the coalition and trying to support each other was much more different than, as Eric said, like 30 or even 40 years ago. So.
And I do feel like this is a great point that we're kind of already talking about. In a weird way, our panel is not super diverse. And I feel like it's super important for us to actually bring that up, that the Asian American AAPI community is actually super diverse. There are so many different countries that constitute Asia, right? What that means, including South Asians, et cetera. In a way, our slice is kind of a particular slice that actually isn't particularly representative. But I do feel like that is important, and thank you, Jorge, for bringing that up and just kind of giving us that context as well. We became a monolith, even though that's not what we are, but we became we coalesced in a way where everybody was getting targeted. There is kind of a point that was brought up. Jorge and Eric both had kind of made mention of this, this idea that maybe 20, 30, even 40 years ago, this idea that, just don't say anything, don't make waves. And I feel like this is also important, and I wanted to share my own perspective here. I remember as a child so the way I grew up, whenever there was injustice, whenever there was something wrong, I remember very vividly my mother informing that perspective and saying, no, you have to speak up. That is not okay. And that being kind of odd, actually, if you think about it, right? Like 30 years ago, to have an Asian woman talking about this idea of, hey, if someone is pushing you around, you don't just not make waves, you say something. Something's not okay. And perhaps that's also part of my own lens and perspective, where I remember these moments and pockets of advocacy and speaking up. And even though this is on the super micro level, but this idea of, hey, if something is wrong, you have to say something, even if it's an adult, even if it's a teacher, even if it's a moment where you are small and maybe like you are literally a child, but how can you still use your voice and you still have one? And in a way, this recent echoing, like we're talking about here, right, in the news recently and with social media, that it's brought this flavor of, hey, no, you can speak up. And in a way, it's kind of echoed this experience that I've had my whole life.
That kind of brings us to our next question, because there are a lot of myths out there about Asian culture, and there's a lot of myths that can be harmful. So what are some of the myths about Asian culture that can be seen as discriminatory?
Where do you want to start?
Yeah, wherever you want to start.
I mean, I feel like go ahead, Kung.
Oh no, I think Darlene had her hand raised for a while, so I wanted to make sure we got to her.
And that's great that she has her hand raised. Please put it in the chat, because at the
Oh,
end,
okay.
in
I'm
30
sorry.
minutes, at the end, we will be answering all questions. Right now, we just want to get the discussion. So go ahead, Dr.
Okay.
Kong, if you had something to say.
I mean, I think the biggest one, obviously, is probably going to be that model minority myth. So, I mean, we could spend hours and write a dissertation on it if we wanted to, but that's probably one of the more destructive, because it cuts really both ways, to both Asians that achieve and Asians that don't achieve. You know, because I mean, if you guys aren't familiar with the model minority myth, it's just like, oh yeah, Asians are the good ones. You know, they came here, everything's fine. They kept their noses down, they succeed, they don't commit crimes, and they're fine. So just be like them, right? So I mean, imagine you're one of the Asian kids that is doing well. You're going to school, you're getting straight A's, and you know, it's just like, it's not really valued, because you're just, oh, you were supposed to do that, you're Asian. Or the one that's not doing so well, it's like seen as like, oh my God, you failed your race kind of thing. And it's like, what's wrong with you? You're Asian, you're supposed to do well. So, I mean, it doesn't matter. It just cuts both ways with that model minority thing, because, you know, whether you're doing well or you're doing not well, it just, what you do isn't really valued as much. So, I mean, yeah, I remember growing up seeing my friends come home with like C's, and their parents are like, oh my God, you passed. I'm like, what the hell? I should just not go home. I'm not going home with a A- because I'm going to get my, you know, I can't say that here, but you know, that was not cool. A B+, you just, I mean, look for new parents. So it was a very, very, very different standard. And then, so it really does not put as much value or emphasis on people who do achieve, and it makes those that don't achieve feel exponentially worse.
If I can also follow that on the whole model minority myth, one of my first jobs working out of college was to do gang prevention and try to do, help young teenagers, middle school and also high schools who are actually getting into delinquency, to try to find some more positive things for them to do. And the interesting thing that I always found was like, whenever we talk to teachers or anybody would say, you know, I'm surprised that, you know, they're Asians are actually getting into delinquency. And to my surprise, or actually not to my surprise, the fact that everybody thought that they were good students, they always attended school, and all that, that could not possibly lead somebody to crime. And when I work with some of those individuals on probations or going to the California youth authorities, they're saying, yeah, they think we do that. We go to school, we get our grades, but at night after school, we go do our thing. So I think there's also a kind of a duality in regards to how people perceive a particular group of individuals, and they never think of any other possibilities, because they have no conceptual framework to really think about, oh, people can be different. They may have different aspects to who they are, and we just judge them from a very limited perspective that we know them from. So.
You know, Deborah, I remember two things. I remember when I was growing up, my mother would always say, you're Asian, never let anybody know what you're thinking. And so there was always, I think, like a perception out there that you couldn't trust Asians, because they would never tell you, they would never show their cards, or they weren't honest with you. And so I think that has that, and again, we're speaking of the model minority, but I think those things even have an impact upon areas of society that are not so visible. You know, that when I mean visible, I'm meaning some of these hate crimes that we're talking about. But even if you look at the recruiting industry, you know, if you're a recruiter and you're submitting names to a company for potential interviews, if you have that model minority attached to you, or these stereotypes, you're not even going to get into the door with an interview, because the company is going to look at that name and not even have that headhunting company even submit the name for an interview. So, you know, it really permeates all areas of society, from the very, very visible things we're talking about to things that we really don't see, you know, kind of below the surface.
Yeah. And just to kind of add to some of this model minority, because I feel like there's also another piece of that where it's not just someone that's going to stay quiet and do their job, this idea that they'll do more with less. So you can underpay them and they'll still work hard. And I feel like this is actually something I've had to, as a person that's a hard worker, I've also had to re-examine what those expectations look like, because just because I'm a hard worker doesn't mean that I don't have value, and doesn't mean that that's not worthy of value. And then also kind of what those expectations from others and what that places on me. I also wanted to add, as the woman on the panel, the intersectionality of being a woman and being an Asian person. So being an Asian female actually comes with its own degrees of other stereotypes as well. So this idea of this so-called kind of sexual exotic nature, super demure, someone that doesn't speak what they're thinking, someone that is very kind of doesn't say what they're thinking about, or is very meek or very quiet. This idea that, I don't know, that women drive, like Asian women drivers, like something like that. Like, I feel like that's something that exists as a stereotype. There's also something else that has been echoed. Eric and Jorge and Blake have also mentioned this as well, that you know, the right careers are supposed to have, and this is, and I put this in quotations because this is actually not my experience personally, which also puts me sort of out of joint with what expectations are. But you guys had mentioned, right, this idea that you're a business person, or you study, you're a physician or a doctor or something, or a lawyer. And I feel like, again, this is part of my own experience and my own perspective, that the way I was raised and the way I grew up was, you need to find something that makes you happy. Hopefully you can find something where you can make a living off of it, but you need to find happiness in what you do. And I feel like that, the way I was taught, even in that perspective, is contrary, right? That's contrary to these stereotypes that we're talking about, and in a way made it abnormal. But also perhaps is another reason why it's framed my perspective in such a way. But I feel like it's important to talk about like where these things come from, right? You know, Chief, we were talking about like never let anyone know what you're thinking. This also extends into this idea of lack of emotion, right? There's stereotypes in Asian communities about individuals not being emotionally in touch. And how can we talk about the way we feel about things, and how can we normalize that as well?
And I'm wondering, like, POV, point of view, is really important. And how does that play into all of this? Because, you know, I know, you know, as an African American person, that's very important, but it's different for each person in each culture, because there's so many different types of African American people, right? So how does that play into it here?
I mean, this is the interaction, right? Like, this is
Mhm.
all of it. Like, I feel as I'm sharing things, and hopefully the audience is getting a gauge, that the way that I grew up is maybe perhaps not stereotyped to what we're talking about, right? Like when we talk about these expectations of, you know, hey, these are the only jobs you can have. Hey, you need to stay quiet. Hey, this is what a good person is supposed to look like. That's actually not how I was raised. So it's really, I have known this since I was small, that my identity is not the same as what the group identity might look like. But I am conscious and aware, and have been since basically once you become aware of other people and other communities that look like you but aren't the same, that you have to take those things under consideration. I have had instances where I would be in rooms that if it was someone that didn't look like me, the way they would be interacted with would not look that way, because of the expectations and the stereotypes that people have in their own preconceived notion, right? You know, obviously this is over Zoom, but I'm not very tall. I'm like 5'1". I'm a petite woman. And being a petite Asian woman comes with certain expectations about, oh, well, she's little, like she's not gonna like rock the boat. And when I start to speak up, it's confusing. I mean, frankly, that's just the truth. People don't really know what to do with me. And it confuses their idea and expectation. And I think that is basically what we're talking about, right? All of us have preconceived notions about everything because we're humans. Humans like to create categories. That's just part of our way of working things out, right? From the caveman days of, hey, if you look like me, you must be like me, so you must be someone safe. Or this idea that you don't look like me, so you must bring disease, or you might be stealing my crops, or, right? This idea that you are afraid of what you don't know. But the problem is when you don't know what it is you're afraid of, and you have all of these stereotypes associated with it, and how you navigate those things and help try to basically create teachable moments in your life journey.
Yeah, Chief Chow?
Yes, I was going to say, and really kind of a story that was interesting. When I made captain, in 2005, I was a brand new captain, and I remember I remember some community business people coming to me and sitting in my office. 3 of them came in, they sat down and they said, we're having a problem with one of your officers and this is what we want you to do. And I started thinking, I wonder if they thought they were going to, they're using, maybe feeding off the stereotype that this brand new Asian captain was going to take that stereotypical role with them and just, acquiesce to whatever they had asked. And I felt that as I kind of developed my career, I had to pay extra attention to ensuring that I was really clearly communicating what my expectations of myself as a leader were, especially to the people that I dealt with, because I think all of us have always had that stereotype kind of in front of us that, Asians will just kind of acquiesce to whatever you're asking. They don't like to make waves, but, when you're in a leadership position, anything could be further from the truth. But it has always been something that's out there that I felt I had to be conscious of.
I wanted to also add, and I agree with Cindy, I think it's a point of view in how you find models actually makes a huge difference as to how you grow up and what kind of values you add. I've often seen, especially many of the Asian families that immigrate to the US or to the West, women tend to actually do much better. They actually speak up. They actually are not so much afraid as what the society may actually either stereotype or potentially kind of react in a very negative way. And I've seen many males coming from Asian countries or Asian cultures that were doing fairly well back home. They really don't do so well here. I think the opportunity for women to speak up. I'm also wondering whether the cultural, the oppressed culture back in their country of origins also does not allow for many of the women to really thrive and do what they can actually do. And I've seen like a great example is my mom. When she was in Cuba, she was just a housewife. And then, she got depressed and she had all kinds of problems because she had no ability to either make her own money or even have a say. And when she actually got here, she was able to work and make some money. And looking back, I've noticed that, her sense of self productivity, efficacy actually improved to the point where, she's become a great role model for me to see women as strong individuals. And whenever people, tend to fall back into the whole traditional role, that's what a stereotypical Asian woman is supposed to be, I find like I've become one of the most avid advocates for women to actually do more and not to fit that stereotype. So I do agree, points of view, and it's also like modeling and social learning, and also what your parents model to you makes a huge, huge difference.
So yeah, I think one of the biggest impacts of point of view, at least from my perspective, is like kind of which generation you were. So, I mean, as Asians, we're kind of one of the, I guess, newer ethnicities to this country, and we're still really new. If in population-wise, it's only like what 5% of us. So, and a lot of them are immigrants, right? Whereas other races, it's like, there's not a lot of newer immigrants. So, generationally, it makes a huge difference. Like for my parents, they're immigrants to this country. Their way of point of view or looking at things, very, very different from mine. My total time in Asia total is maybe a month. So the rest of my entire life has been in America. So that's where my point of view comes from. So, if you're looking for someone who's just going to acquiesce and keep quiet and all that, you're going to be very disappointed when you meet me, because that's not how I grew up. And that's just not. That's not the American way, really. If something bugs you, you say something about it. You fight, you protest, whatever. Whereas somebody from another generation coming to America as an immigrant, that's what they're used to. They're just being quiet, getting along with people, just keeping your head down, that kind of thing. So the point of view, really depends kind of also on what generation you're here, your immigration status, when you came here, because we are still a very, very small percentage of the population, and just very, very new to a lot of people. So that's where I think a lot of the misperceptions of Asian Americans comes from as well.
And Eric, I really appreciate you kind of bringing that up as well, because regardless of the generation per se, I love that you also brought up status and other things, but realistically, depending on the phase you are in, wherever you are, whether we're talking about, I mean, I know specifically we're talking about AAPI, but oftentimes the reason why you have to acquiesce is because you need to put food on the table, right? Sometimes you can't make that choice to speak up because it's not safe to do so, even though it's not the right thing, right? And the idea that the importance of speaking up, and how that's become something that, you know, thankfully and hopefully continues to be something that our culture and our society can be aware of. Like, I love that you were saying that too, Eric, this idea of like, that's not the American way. The American way is we have to speak up. There has to sometimes be conflict in order for us to get to a resolution. And hopefully that continues to encourage current generations and future ones to do the same.
Well, that brings us to our next question. You guys are like just diving into a lot of the discussion today, and it has to do with generations. And one of the question really is have the recent events of today's society affected our views across generations? Because I was just on a rehearsal for the BLM panel, and we have a Black Panther, we have someone from BLM, and we have, you know, people, law enforcement, and people from all sides, and they're talking about how the young people don't even understand what that was like, and how sometimes you had to be silent, you had to be the first one, even if it was stereotypical, so that there could be a next one, right? But some generations just, they're not grasping that because they didn't have the same struggle, and the struggle is very different than it is today. So I was just wondering how that goes with this conversation.
You know,
I think that this is,
oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Cindy, please.
Oh, okay. There was just something I was thinking too, you know, when, like even thinking about, so, you know, I've heard a little bit about my mother and the model that she provided for me, but I think it also spoke to when she was growing up and her perspective, it meant that she was the odd one out. Does that make sense when I say that, right? The idea that if you're from a generation where you're growing up, you know, you're born in the 50s or so, and you're growing up and you have a very strong sense of equality, right? You have a very strong sense of what's right and what's wrong. You have a very strong sense of speaking up. You have a very strong sense of advocacy and championing, and your dominant culture doesn't do that. You don't fit in, right? It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like home. And I feel like maybe that's also the flavor too that Debra, you're talking about, right? That even if those things are valued and you find people that value it as well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be happy in that time until there are greater opportunities in the future where it becomes more acceptable or appropriate.
You know, Debra, each generation brings to bear its own experience. You know, I'm probably third generation here, and my grandparents, as I mentioned, came over in 1910, and my grandmother ended up on Angel Island probably for like 8 months before she was allowed to go over and be with her husband in San Francisco. And if you know anything about Angel Island, it was more of a detention facility than it was an immigration processing facility. And so when they came over here, they were prevented from owning land, so they were basically sharecroppers. And my parents have no idea what my grandparents went through, and I have no idea what my parents went through. And my kids are growing up in a completely different environment. But what I've noticed about the younger generation is, as has been mentioned here, they're more apt to speak up. So we had a Chiefs AAPI panel on Zoom probably about 4 months ago, and usually we have about 40 people show up to that when we were having them in person. This time we had 250 people show up on Zoom, and I would say at least half of them were young people that I'd never encountered at an AAPI panel before, and they brought perspective to things and asked us questions. You know, they asked us some tough questions, but that's really what you want when you put a group of people together, that you want some input from the community. You don't want to be patted on the back all the time. So, you know, I really respect this generation's desire to become involved, because I don't think, like looking back at the subsequent generations, including mine and my parents and my grandparents, that degree of wanting to become involved and trying to affect change and make things better for everybody was not something that was at the forefront as it is right now.
If I can also add to what Chief Blake said, I think there's definitely some progress in voicing opinions and taking more activism through generations. But I also noticed that many Asian groups actually continue to have immigration waves coming. So even though there's a generational progression here for those who have set roots and have families, there's always like that. I always find it interesting to find conflictual kind of perspectives from the same groups, from those who actually are recently arrived. And oftentimes they seem to be even politically polarized in many ways. So I'm also wondering, as their children, if they do set roots here, will start thinking more in the speaking up, or in some groups, I see like the sense of entitlement is quite there. It's like, I'm from this place because we're doing really well. Why am I going to be treated differently? So they're speaking up, I see sometimes as having different goals. And one is like for justice, the other one is for entitlement. And I always find that to be quite interesting, sitting back and kind of watching, I'm like, interesting. Where do I fit in somewhere around there? Being someone as a 1.5 generation, and that's for those who may not know, it's not anybody who's come here under the age of 12 and actually grows up here. And also, again, having a different cultural perspective on things or identities. I tend to kind of sit back and watch a lot of things rather than just voicing much more opinion. So at times, I end up choosing not to say things and think about it, and other times I may choose to really just speak up and cause trouble. So people oftentimes find that I'm somewhat unpredictable. The days that they expect me to be very traditional, I'm not. The time that they expect me to speak up, I'm also very traditional. So there's still a struggle with that for myself. And again, point of view and experiences and modeling have shaped quite a bit of how I react to things too.
Just one more thing I wanted to add from a personal level. With the generation gap, I'll use my parents as an example again. There's like a huge political difference as well, because like my dad in the 50s, he fled Chinese communism. And if you guys are not familiar with Chinese communism, it is very, very different from what things are like politically in America. I mean, I was watching something on Netflix the other day about our Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, you have right to a trial, all these rights. Whereas in communist political environment, you don't have any of those rights. You cannot talk, you cannot protest, you cannot speak. If we were to hold something like this about the government in China, half of us would disappear tomorrow and never to be heard from again. The other half would disappear and be re-educated a few months later. So this is not something that happens politically in certain Asian countries. So, immigrants coming here, they're like, can we even say this? Can we speak up for ourselves? Can we protest? Or are we going to be, locked up like, people are even today, people are getting locked up for protesting. People are getting censored. Like everything you do online in China is censored. This Zoom meeting would have, a government watcher or something looking into it. So a lot of the freedoms that we enjoy here are not enjoyed by a lot of Asian countries. So it's very weird when Asians come here and they're like, well, we can do all this stuff. For the new generations like myself, this is just like, basic. Yes, of course we can speak up and protest and say things, and we have this freedom of press and religion, and we can do whatever we want. We can live our hopes and dreams because those are our rights. But that concept of this is our right is a foreign concept a lot of time to newer immigrants who politically grew up in a very, very, very different environment.
Sorry, go ahead, Jorge.
I agree with Eric. I think the culture and the values are very different because I would, as Eric was pointing out, like if we were in a communist country, we have a government official. And I would say, actually, the chief is a government official, an authority figure who in a very communist regime, he'll be like, taking notes and making sure that we disappear the next day or something like that. But the beauty about this whole freedom of speech and being able to say what you have on your mind, it's something that it's quite unique. And I would say to the U.S. In the sense that people do welcome dissenting views and try to have some sort of a peaceful and cordial kind of a disagreement, but in other places it's really about life and death. So I think values and culture it's quite different. So
And this sort of dovetails into sort of the point of view, right? Like I feel like Jorge, you were mentioning about that generational separation, right? This idea of people, and I feel like Eric as well, right? This idea that people, maybe the previous generation or whatever initial generation that comes and is coming from the stark difference of wherever they came from and whatever perhaps repressive environment that might have been. And there was something in the language you were saying, Jorge, about like this younger generation, and you use the language of like entitlement, right? And I feel like perhaps this is also an opportunity for us to think about, what does entitlement mean, right? Like, because I feel like Eric, you kind of talked about this as well, right? Is it really entitlement, or is it this idea of it's humanness, right? Are we talking about humanness and human qualities that should be able to exist? And I mean, even, you know, Deputy Chief, you were talking about this idea of, we don't necessarily know the history of our parents' generation or the generation prior, but who says we can't begin to have those conversations? I feel like stories are so valuable. Like we have to know where we come from in order to know where to go. There's something powerful in, like we know this, right? We know this. Our history is literally in our DNA, right? All the good and the bad and the ugly, right? It's in us. And there's something powerful in the stories that we know and the stories that we learn. And I feel like that's something that I feel like I carry with me. I carry with me the stories of my mother. I carry the stories of my grandmother. I carry those stories with me of speaking up, of when do you have to, like, what do you have to do to say things? What do you need to do just to make sure that maybe you have to pick the right time to do something, instead of necessarily always just like, you know, popping off, because I mean, that's not going to be effective, right? But this idea of, those are things that I carry with me, and I feel like those are some things that we can also give to the next generation and even the one prior. How can we have those more intimate, personal conversations to get to know, what was that story? What was that story like and that journey like, and the importance of knowing about that journey and what we can learn from it.
Yeah, and you know, that brings us to another question that we have is like, have there been behavioral changes in Asian and non-Asian cultures, you know, happening today, like, you know, across generations? I mean, and some of those, you know, behavioral changes are probably good and bad, right? And so what, you know, what do you think about that?
I feel like this also brings up, like, I mean, whether we like it or not, we have to talk about political things because it informs the way we live our life. I feel like for better or worse, there used to be this cultural thing, maybe across the board, that, you know what, everybody, you just leave your skeletons in your closet and it's fine. And then it was this moment of, you know what, actually, let's blow that door open and let's just live those skeletons loudly and proudly and whatever that means. But I feel like that's actually given this opportunity for, hey, you know what, just because these conversations are uncomfortable doesn't mean you shouldn't have them. And the power of those conversations, what benefit does it actually have if you're sitting around a Thanksgiving table and you have some family member that has an opposing point of view and you just shut your mouth and chew your food, as opposed to trying to have a conversation about where someone comes from? Because the reality is, people come, all the conclusions of these perspectives, they generally come from a place of, you're afraid of you don't know. You're afraid of what you don't know, right? And the reality is that, like we talked about at the beginning, we know this as human beings. Our brains aren't very evolved. We're very bad at creating connections and bridging those things. It's much easier to be like, this is a box, and this is a square, and this is a circle, and this is an oval, instead of actually thinking about the humanness that we are quite different and we are quite individual, but that just takes too many brain cells, right? And the power of bringing those skeletons out of the closet and actually talking about them, instead of like, oh no, it's just something someone talks about when they drink a little too much, like it's not a big deal.
I would definitely agree with what Cindy had said in regards to sharing stories and bringing skeletons out into really dispelling the myth or the anxiety or the fear that people have. But I'm also wondering if some of us have experienced where we want to hear our parents' story, we want to hear the oldest generation story, but they're unwilling to share. And they still have this conception that someone is watching, or they say something negatively that impacts their past lives with the governments, that they're going to come back. And a perfect example is my mom. I keep wanting to ask her more about things, and she's like, no, don't, because the people are listening, and it could go back and it could impact our family and generations and so forth. So it's always like interesting for me to, even though I bring issues out that I want to learn about my family, my history, she doesn't know it that much either. He reaches the point that there's no lineage that she can go back to and really share, so that I can know really where I'm from, and to be proud, and the good, the bad, and ugly. It's more like I have to kind of piece many of the gaps that are in between either her memory or her knowledge of her family. And even when I try to do that with my dad, who's passed quite a few years ago, he would not say. He would just pretty much close. All he would present is a very rosy picture of, what he experienced in World War II and the Japanese invasion and all that. So so it was really kind of like, am I even, are you really the last name, or are you one of those paper sons? And this is a very common thing that Chief Chow mentioned about individuality. Like, people were actually buying tickets and actually selling their kids so that they could immigrate to other countries and kind of send money back. So oftentimes, many of the last names that we have, they're not really the biological family names that the initial parents or the individual that came over is really from. So I've always been curious whether I'm really a Wong or something else. And my mom said, I think you're not a Wong, you could be something else. But I was never able to even get that kind of history of identity and where it came from, even from my dad. So I do believe that sharing discussions, and I think having more difficult conversations and hearing the other side, and hearing, you may not agree initially, but also introspect and reflect, and you come back and continue that conversation is very, very positive, I'd say.
And we have, if there's no more comments on that one, we have a question that'll take us to our last 15 minutes of discussion before we go to the Q&A. But I always want to leave people with how to create change, right? And this is about leadership and change this year. How can we promote unity and change within all communities?
We've touched on this a little bit. I feel like this idea of, and I feel like this comes with a caveat, right? Because sometimes it's not safe in a certain moment or a certain pocket, or sometimes in history, like we talked about. However, what can we do, even in small micro interactions, advocate and speak up, or even speak up to our own experience to the best of our ability? I feel like there have been moments of, I feel like, again, like I've shared it, this is just it's the part of the fabric of me, but this idea of moments where, okay, how can you say something? How can you do something? If you can't do something, how can you have a discussion about something? It doesn't have to be a huge tidal wave, but it can start with that first ripple, that first interaction. And I feel like that's really powerful. And how can we face our own fears of what we think that might look like or not? Does that make sense? Like this idea of we're afraid, or maybe we're not, but this idea that conflict in general for the human experience is uncomfortable. And I think this idea that how can we try to sit with a little bit of discomfort, because maybe we can learn something. And maybe this can be an opportunity to humanize a perspective that we didn't understand before. This idea that we've shared, all of us have talked about this idea of, different moments in our lives where we've observed things that haven't been okay, or of course with recent news and kind of social media and greater attention. But when we see something, even if there's small interactions, what can we do about those things to speak up and have those conversations?
Debra,
Yeah, I'm good.
I think there's two things that, interesting, if you look back at history in the United States, everybody that has come, that is living in this country, with probably the exception of the Native American, immigrated here at one point in time. And every group that has come to this country has suffered some sort of discrimination against them, even though maybe some of these groups have been here for hundreds of years now, but it all follows the same path. So there's really two things, in my opinion, I think that really will affect change. Number one, I think, is laws. the prevention, housing discrimination, employment discrimination, things like that. Those are things that kind of draw the line in the sand. But the hardest thing that is going to have to be changed is what Cindy had spoke about. That's the attitudes. And I don't really know what the answer to that is, but I think it's some role modeling, but I also think that it has to be one contact at a time. And unfortunately, I don't know if we'll ever get there, but we have quite a task ahead of us. But in my opinion, that is probably the biggest challenge that we all have.
So yeah, I definitely agree. Like Cindy said earlier, conflict is very uncomfortable, and we have to start being okay with talking about uncomfortable things. Like, people didn't just all of a sudden start becoming racist. There have been racists for a long time, many years, decades, centuries probably. It's just not all of a sudden there's a bunch of racists. But there still are a lot of racists around. But kind of the message these days is, well, if you're a racist, just keep quiet, don't say anything, or you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But they're still racist, and we need to be able to talk about these things that make us uncomfortable. Like from a clinical perspective, somebody comes to you, you don't just tell them to, well, if it's just shut up, don't talk about that. You want them to talk about things that make them uncomfortable, that maybe they have this really distorted perception about Asian Americans or something. You don't just tell them to shut up about it. You want them to tell you why they're racist, how they're racist, what their perceptions are, and then like Blake was saying, try to change that perception on an individual contact. But we can't just have this mentality of just keep all your negative emotions inside you, keep all your negative perspectives inside, and don't talk about it. All right, we have to be able to talk about it in an open form, even if people aren't comfortable with it, because I know there's a lot of racists out there, but no one's willing to talk about it and admit it, right? So, if you're racist, come on, let's talk about it and let's figure that out, and let's, correct some of those thoughts that you might be having or experiences that you might have had, because it's probably incorrect, right? So we have to have forums where we could talk about that. Again, like it's just going to be uncomfortable, definitely, but we have to give people that chance.
And even this idea of like racism, and for us to think about it as, in truth, it really comes from a place of ignorance, right? You just don't know. And if you don't know, you can't necessarily learn more if you don't know something. So I think that this is in positions like ours or in others where you might be the one who is talking to someone who might have a perspective that is different from yours. But I guess this is everything, right? We don't all have the same perspective about everything. But this idea of how can we come to these conversations with an openness of, I don't know all the answers, you don't know all the answers. How can we talk? How can we try to cut through? We just don't know something. And instead of kind of putting someone in a box already, right? Because I feel like some of us too, we might feel some type of way about someone that uses racial slurs, right? Probably. I do. I admit that. I feel like many of us, even as clinicians, you've worked with clients that they say things that it doesn't sit well with you. That's part of our life, right? But how can we use those opportunities to talk about it? And I feel like this is actually maybe a little contrary to maybe some of our traditional training or even like education, right? This idea of just because it's something that's uncomfortable, we're just supposed to sit it and like leave it there maybe. But this idea that actually, no, how can we turn these into small moments? How can that be a greater dialogue? And how can sometimes you disclose and be honest and authentic about your experience, right? Because they need to see that humanity in you in order to make that connection.
I want to take a different approach to the question. I would say that discrimination and racism have been in existence for as long as humans have been around. And the easy thing that I see here in the US is that we have different skin colors, and we can get discriminated based on skin color. But even my experiences have been that even in places where there's a lot of Asians, there's still discrimination. And it's not necessarily just by skin tone, but also by regions where you came from, how you pronounce certain things, and because my group is better than your group, or don't marry somebody else from another group because who knows what's going to happen. So I think it's a really difficult thing to really address. And is not just about ignorance, but it's also about protecting power and status. You don't want to share oftentimes, what your group has with the other group, because everybody has this idea like the zero-sum game, that if I give you something, I'm going to have less, rather than we can all prosper together. So for myself, and I've seen that in Latinos or Hispanic cultures, but even within like many of the Mexican folks, because we have more Mexicans in California, there's definitely a pecking order. Amongst the Chinese, there's a pecking order. You get Japanese, Koreans, Indians, there's definitely a pecking orders. And surprisingly, I thought that was quite unique until I did a fellowship in Washington, D.C., and I met someone who was actually going to Howard University. And then he was saying, there is a pecking order amongst Blacks and Africans, because the Africans from Africa don't consider the African Americans or the Blacks like really Africans. And even amongst them, there's like different pecking orders for which tribe and which things, or where they actually coming from. So I think it's much more difficult to really having those conversations and being open to sharing and trying to dispel stereotypes or fears. And the other thing I also feel that if we really feel like that is something that needs to be dispelled, I also feel that it is also our responsibilities to kind of participate in the whole dialogue or be there, not only to model, but also bring a different perspective to kind of make that uncomfortable, the sense of uncomfortness and having to deal with it. But it's also challenging, because I see other people feeling that, why am I always the only Asian or the Asian expert on all Asians in a group where I'm the only one? But also feel that that's a great opportunity if we were to kind of turn it on its head and say, hey, this is an opportunity I can potentially educate or share a different perspective that may not really change your perspective now, but it may germinate a potential idea that you might be more open to embracing later on. So yeah, I think it's a difficult thing. And I think that anywhere that we have humans competing against each other for resources, racism and discrimination and institutional racism that we're looking at right now, it exists. It's just that there may be a different criterion in which they're actually being judged on. Yeah.
I also appreciate, Jorge, you bringing up the concept of colorism. I know people don't talk about it a lot, but it absolutely exists in the Asian community. And that's a thing. I mean, thank you, ethnocentrism. But this idea that that's also part of it, right? That there is just as much inter-AAPI racism and just ignorance, and that idea of that so-called fighting for resources that we also have to overcome even within our own families.
Yeah, and I really wasn't aware that it was that strong, the colorism. I knew it existed, but I know in African American culture, it's a big thing. Okay. And so I didn't realize that it was so much in the Asian culture. So you just taught me something.
Yeah, it's really, really big. Like Cindy, she's a lot paler than I am, so she'd be better than me. And if I were a female, I'd be told to go bleach my skin to be paler like her. And there's products you can buy off the shelf that'll bleach your skin to look like Cindy, because that's she'd be considered higher status, higher power, that kind of thing. Yeah.
And what's funny too, Eric, when you say that, so A, it's the lighting, but also B, I'm the kind of Asian that I have to have different foundation colors throughout the year because I tan. So I can be really brown in the summer. And this is the thing too about, especially Taiwanese families. I kind of like to think about it like many Latin households. There's so much blending in our communities that literally all of like my mom's side of the family, every single one of her brothers and her, they're different shades, all the way from very, very dark to very, very fair with like pink undertones, which is very, something you wouldn't expect, but it's the variety. And even in Asian communities, I mean, Eric, you're speaking to this. I don't consider myself that pale, but it's a relativity game, right? So here I'm currently in East Asia, but this idea, like I'm actually kind of dark here. And I'll have friends that are Filipino descent that might be darker toned, and they'll say, oh, you're like really pale, like really fair. But it's all about that relativity in terms of colorism and what that looks like. And also what season it is and how much sun you get.
Wow. I really thought, I mean, honestly, that it was more of an African American thing. and so to hear that, it's like, my mind's just kind of racing right now, and that tells you how I am being educated, right? I mean, I knew that there were Asian people who were Black. I knew there were Asian people, and no one talks about them. I didn't know that the variations was as strong as it was in other cultures.
One thing I always remember growing up with, my mom would hate it when my sister and I would kind of tan or play in the sun too much, because we'll get dark. And later on, we learned that back when they were growing up, the people that were having dark skin work in the fields, and all the rich and affluent people stay indoors. So the fairer the skin, the more wealth, or the better life that you would have. So I think and I've seen now that it's sometimes like, hey, even like the looks, they're trying to simulate a lot of the more industrialized countries with nose ridges or higher cheekbones and things like that. And not only just about the makeup industry, but also the plastic surgery industries really help to clean or kind of whiten quite a bit. So the whole whitewash idea has been quite interesting for me to watch throughout whole Asia. So
I did know about the eye surgery. That I had a friend in high school who did that. So
I don't know if you've seen in social media, there's many whatever those TikTok or whatever things where people started putting on makeup and they transform themselves like
yes,
in person. And
yes.
and as Cindy was saying, like the makeup, they make it so pale that it's like, oh my God, you look like a Asian Barbie doll type. When in reality they're much darker, and the face doesn't even look like the same way.
Wow. Well, thank you guys so much so far for the discussion, and we can continue this, but we also at this point open it up for people to ask questions. So you can ask questions two ways. You can just open your mic and start asking questions, or you can also put them in the chat. But if you are going to open your mic and ask questions, we ask for you to be respectful of that, because then we'll have to mute your mic, and I would hate to do that. So I want there to be a big discussion for us to talk about this wonderful topic and talk to our wonderful presenters who have given us so much information. So if there are questions, let's begin that.
Okay, I've got a question.
Oh, and then Yal. Yal has a question too.
Okay, let him go first.
Oh, go ahead, Scott.
Okay, well, so let's say this is the start of the movement and you guys are planning it. And so looking at what Black Lives Matter has accomplished, but then all of the attacks and propaganda that's come against them, and the same with the LGBTQ plus movement. How would you design it? It's so much to me about conversation and getting to the people that don't have a background, don't understand, haven't had the experience to have the opportunity to have this sort of dialogue. How would you, as a group, plan that and launch that? What are the things you take to it?
So you bring up a very, very interesting problem, is that there's the percentage of the population that's Asian is very, very small, and we're also highly concentrated. So most of the country, most Americans have never met an Asian person. Like if you look at the dispersion of Asians in the country, we're just in little small pockets here and there. So like LA, New York, DC, that kind of thing. So most have not met an Asian person. Every time I have students from other states, a lot of times I'm the first Asian person they've ever met. And so it is a very, very difficult thing to do what Scott was mentioning, to kind of introduce us to them, because and unfortunately the only exposure they get to us is through various forms of media, whether that be social media, movies, TV. And unfortunately, Asians are not portrayed that well on movies and TVs, at least historically. Now they're a little bit better, but it's still just like, very stereotypical roles on TV and movies and social media. So it would take a lot of us going out to a lot of very different places, because we just aren't in the majority of America. Sure. There's just, so it is very, very difficult.
And Bobby Hyde, I do see your hand, and I will get to you in just a moment. Anyone want to respond to this?
I mean, I feel like there is a little bit of, Eric, I agree, which I think for many of us here, we grew up in metropolitan areas. So when you grow up and you kind of get launched out into the world and people are like, oh, you're the first Asian person I've ever met. You're just like, wait, what? I'm the first Asian person you've ever met. But this idea because I mean, like Eric too, as a professor and an instructor, that was actually one of those crazy things. Like I spent about 4 years in Oklahoma, and I was the only visible person of color young woman on the faculty. And it was it was lots of things. It was difficult for me on a personal level. It was very interesting for some of the students. It could be powerful, but it could also be like those small teachable moments. So I feel like for me, kind of like what Eric was talking about. Oh, someone's mic is on. But this idea that these would be the moments of trying to provide those opportunities of, let me share with you my history and where I come from and my background. Let me be that moment of, it's not formal. This is not a panel. This is, hey, I am your instructor, but I'm going to give you a place that you can ask me questions, and I will share some of me so that you see me, I'm a human. Those have had to be my way of trying to do this, having to do like literally so many small interactions of dispelling myths, having conversations, trying to be open, putting my ego aside. That's the truth. Having people tell me things like, wow, your English is so good. And I'm like, I was born in Wisconsin. Like, what do you want from me? Right. But, just conversations like this, right, where people will say things, or, wow, like your diction is really, really great, or, just, wow, you don't really have an accent, do you? Or but those are my experiences, right? Not to say that anything wrong with having different perspectives, but this idea that how can you give people opportunities to try to have those conversations with you? If you can, trying to be open about being visible in your community, which is heavy, actually. I feel like I did this a lot when I was in Oklahoma, because I was the only real person of color in terms of like my work and things like that. But putting yourself out there, doing trainings, trying to do educational moments with my professionals, my peers, but also in the community. All of these small interactions are important to try to do.
If I could just add to that, and that's a difficult thing, as Cindy was saying. I don't know if there's an organized solution to any of this, really. But it's very difficult to say, well, it's reliant upon one interaction at a time. But in reality, it is. My kids are growing up in a much different environment than I did, and I grew up in a much different environment than my parents, and I know they grew up in a much different environment than their parents. And I remember this story because when I was a kid, we lived next to this family. He was the gentleman that lived next door. He lived with his wife. He was a Korean War vet, and he was kind of like Clint Eastwood was in that movie Gran Torino. And something happened. My brother and I were playing ball in the front yard, and he came out and he said something that I don't even want to repeat on here about our ethnicity. And my mom went over there, and I'll just say she lit him up. And when my father passed away, when I was 17, he almost became a second father to me. He taught me how to work on cars. I watched him work on his van, and my mother and his wife became best friends. And it was nothing that was organized. It was just two cultures coming together, and the wall came down. And it's really, I know it sounds kind of cliche, but it's really about changing hearts and minds. That's really what you have to do. And I don't know if there's an organized effort that can actually get that deep into what really needs to be changed in society, other than these individual interactions between people that break down these stereotypes.
And go ahead.
I just saw that there was a question in the chat from, did she want me to address that now, or do you want me to jump back to that later?
No, I'm going to bring it back around, but right now we're going to have Yal ask his question.
Yeah, what a great start off. What a great start off for the Script Conference. And I guess my question is pretty much along what has already been asked. How can we do this? How do you feel we can further these connections? I want to just say also too, kind of like for me, I'm in my mid-60s. I live in New York City. this is sort of like the same play, but a different cast of characters. I want to also honor and raise up the Asian Black Panthers. You know, I want to talk about Richard Aoki. I want to talk about Mike Tawaga. I want to talk about Yuri, who held Malcolm's head in the Audubon Ballroom when he was assassinated. We have been doing this for a long, long time. We have been connected for a long, long time. You know what? A Nigerian mother wants the same thing that any Asian mother wants for their child. What? You social work? You better go back and go to med school. So if we start sitting, I don't know if it's about changing the hearts and minds as much as sitting with each other's hearts and minds. That's this thing that's so rich and that we can tap into. Blake, I just wanted to add on. You had said something about all immigrants came, but actually Black people came through slavery, and I also think that's important, right? Folk need to know. Guess what? You built a railroad, and they came up with laws to exclude you. But again, I just think it's important that the history becomes our way that we can heal. And you're right. Look, 30 years ago, I wouldn't have had the benefit of having all of these Asian colleagues that do therapy and working around that. That's the shift. We're about unmodeling the model. You and I, we didn't create this. White body supremacy said, this is what we're going to do. So thank you so very much. I love you all. Thank you.
Okay, let me just comment real quick on that. I'm very happy you brought that up, because like most people don't like talking about history because it's so boring to them, but we have to know about our history in this country as Asian Americans because we were treated pretty poorly back in the day. And like Yao mentioned, there were tons of laws that were directly aimed at Asian Americans, Chinese Exclusion Act, Geary Act, where we couldn't immigrate here. If you were to immigrate here, you could only open a restaurant. There was a time when it was illegal for Asian men to sit with white women. There's tons of stuff out there that most people don't learn about. And I think this kind of relates to Melinda's question, but we should learn about some of this stuff, like this discriminatory stuff where there were actually laws that said this particular group of people cannot do this. They can't, be here. They can't do that. They have to do this. So we need to learn about this history. We need to learn, like Yao said, about, all the people before us who really, really fought. And back then you really had to fight hard. It's not like now where it's a lot easier. Like back then it was like life or death kind of stuff where you fought for these rights, legal, political, financial, whatever. You were like fighting for these rights, and you were I think earlier Debra, you mentioned like some people are saying kids these days don't know how good they have it because back in the day we really had to fight, and that's what those people had to do back then when the discrimination was just legalized, rampant. And so I'm very happy you brought that up. Thank you.
And just in case people don't know what Melinda's question is, what do you think could be done in secondary education to help? So since it's brought up, let's, address that. And then Bobby Hyde, you're up next.
Education is huge. Like we were talking earlier, right, about this idea of, like, I was speaking for myself, but this idea that I'm aware that my particular lens and the way I grew up is a very, specific slice. However, I have to be conscious of what that slice looks like in terms of the actual landscape of history and prejudice and expectations. And so I mentioned this as a very brief thing, but I'm also a military spouse. And the truth is, what race was used for sex work in the military when there was occupation, right, in Asia? So, the truth is, I've had comments where people will say, oh, you're sitting at the war bride table, or people will make comments like that. And that was part of my experience of lots of blinking and is this really what you're saying, right? But this is part of the history of why people have these perspectives, because there is a reason, there is a root for where this comes from, right? And the way that they were regulated in the United States even, right? When we talk about, that certain races were seen as unclean, or that you would get sick or whatever. This is all part of the history that exists in terms of our country And we have to talk about the parts that aren't shiny because it's still part of us. And we have to know those things, or else we're going to keep making the same errors again and again.
Yeah, you know, to know where we need to go, we need to know where we've been. And that has to be an honest conversation with people as they're becoming educated. I remember I took a class, and one of their presentations was on the effect of the Jim Crow laws in the South. I had no idea. I had no idea that it had that effect on so many people, because in school, all you learned was that the slaves were freed and everything was good. And I'm ashamed to admit, I didn't learn that until I was an adult. So we need to have that education. So again, so we know where we've been, so we can know where we need to go.
If I can just add a little bit more, I think it's also it's a multi-pronged process and also a very long road to plan for. And I'm not sure whether our current society thinks about the long game. You know, they always think like, what is quick? What is the quick return on the investment? And oftentimes spend that long haul process. It is challenging. It's not as rewarding in many ways. And also bringing those along when we actually have the opportunity. That to me means like really spending time and inconveniencing myself to really help bring some sort of insight or education or even a modeling things for them to see that, you know, different ways can be used to address the same issue. I would also, you know, point out that depending on the political kind of climate and who's actually at the helm, and I think that's why leadership is important. We need to be there. We need to somehow not only be there, fight our way in, but they also need to be invited, or someone has to feel that it's inclusive, is not threatening to their existence or their platform to have a more diverse kind of a perspective on things. Because whenever we have more diverse views, you may not get as much as you wanted from the beginning. And we kind of need to learn that that's okay. Some days I win some days I lose some days we just end up even. And ultimately, I think we collectively actually can prosper. But that's very challenging. And I find that especially in more kind of Western cultures where the whole idea of being an individual seems to rule as compared to what is the best for the group. So sometimes that is also a very conflicting kind of a value proposition. For me, I would say like instead of just being like the only Asian in places, having kind of, since I've been in the US, I've grown up in the Bay Area in San Francisco, but I wanted to learn about other cultures. So I remember when I first went to interview for internship, I went to New York. And in the interviews, they were asking, why do you want to come to New York? And I was very straightforward. I'd like to, you know, learn about the Jewish culture, or you know, really understand what a real bagel is, because you know you hear that California bagels are not real bagels, and I would get these weird looks from a lot of Jewish doctors, psychologists. They're like, that is such a racist thing, and I'm like, no, I'm telling you what I want to do to expand my cultural perspective on things, and that was not quite welcome. So I think it goes both ways for us to be open, but also for others to also be willing to be part of the conversation and be willing to be there.
And thank you. Bobby Hyde, you had a question. You have to unmute your mic, hon.
Here we are. Okay. Hello, Deborah. Can you hear me? But I can't
Hi,
hear
hon.
you.
How are you?
Okay,
Can you
here I
hear
am.
me?
Hello, Deborah. Yes, Deborah.
Go ahead.
I just want. Sometimes I'm told all the time I talk too much, so we're asking questions here. But I want to make a statement first to people, so you get where I'm coming from. When I graduated high school, world history class, June 1st, before I graduated, we hadn't even touched World War I. We were in the 1800s in my high school graduating class. Maybe some of us read history before that, maybe some, but our teachers, that's where we were, in the 1800s, in my graduating class. Now, I'm not old. I've been in script with Deborah think it's my 5th year, correct? 5th year I'm coming to Scripps. That means if I come to Scripps 5th year, means I'm in many programs during the year, support groups. Right, Deborah? Right.
Yes, you are.
So I want to say, I guess I'm going to direct this to the chief, deputy chief, policeman on the staff, on the thing.
Deputy Chief Blake Chow.
Yes, Deputy Chief Blake Chow. We just experienced, the humans, an entire year. And that's how you started the whole panel out 2 hours ago. So some people say we've changed. Some people have gotten shocked because they couldn't go play with the little kitties in sandboxes. They have to stay home. However, how the question, I guess, is to Chief, how are you going to explain this to your employees? How are you going to explain this to your proteges in the Los Angeles County? How are you going to explain this to the people living in Los Angeles, what we just experienced? I guess that's the general question, Deborah. No, we could talk and talk and talk and talk, but that's that I'm asking the chief.
Let's throw that out to Chief Chow.
Please.
Okay, so when you talk about experience in the last year, are you talking about COVID or are you talking about?
Yes, Chief.
Okay. You know what? That's a good question. It has been it has been a crazy year for us, you know, and a lot of the things that we had talked about earlier, we saw some of the ugliness surface out of COVID and a lot of the messaging that was around it. And I don't, you know, I think it all really goes back to, you know, we have to ensure that we have these personal connections and personal interactions with people that are on a level where that education and that education, that stereotype is broken down or actually communicated properly. And that's the thing that really effectively changes people's opinions about some of these things that we're discussing right now. You know, when I look back at, you know, and then I'll look back, I'll talk about when I came on the job, we had just gone through the 1992 riots and Rodney King, and everybody in the department was forced to go through some sensitivity training. When I look at the department, and I'm not saying this just because I'm a member of the department, I hear a lot of community members tell me this, we're a much different department right now than we were back in 1990. And do you know why? It wasn't that training, it was the faces of the LAPD changed. And the people that we hired were more representative of the community than they were when I came on in 1990, and really more closely reflected the values of the community than they did in 1990. And those connections have been made over the last 30 years, each contact at a time. So I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's from my perspective, how I see what I've seen really helped an organization that was as large as mine really kind of come around and do a 180. And although it took a long time, but that's what I think really was a big factor.
Anyone else want to chime in? We have one more question in the chat. If not, I'll move on to that. Okay, so this is from Victoria Rodriguez, and she said, growing up in Los Angeles, that is such a hard concept to understand. So I think she was talking about being the only one. And in those moments, when you are the first person of color, do you often feel pressured to represent your culture or even people of color in general?
So I'll go ahead and start.
Okay.
Yes. I realized that when we're in positions, and I'm just speaking for my organization, obviously, but when you're a person of color in a leadership position, or you do have an extra responsibility that is added on to you when you are in your job, in your people's, probably some people's expectations of you, because you are having to be a role model for those others that are coming up through the organization that quite frankly, as I mentioned, when I came on, we didn't have. So I do feel that I have an extra responsibility to actually not only do the job that the chief has given me, but also to do that other piece, in that being a role model and representing not only an API individual, but also a person of color. And I remember, I think I told the story last time we met on Zoom. I was in charge of the Hollenbeck division, which was in East LA at one point in time. And we had gone to a police commission meeting, and one of the individuals that was on our community police advisory board, she introduced me and she said, and even though he's not Hispanic, he's the best captain we've ever had. So, I always just felt like I was doing my job, but when you realize that you have an added responsibility in those positions when you are given this position.
Okay, I can go next. Yeah, the answer is yes. You do feel like, you're you got to represent your culture. Again, because we're such a small minority, and I know I keep repeating that, but there are just so few of us, especially in, there's the stereotypical professions, where there's a lot of us, like, doctors, engineers, whatever, but outside of those professions, there's very, very few of us. Try to find an Asian psychologist. There's very, very few. Anything Asian mental health, very few, because that's not really a good career to go into historically. So there are very few of us. Population-wise, there's very few of us. You definitely feel needing to kind of represent your people, be on your best behavior, especially if you're the first one they've ever encountered. So it's it is a lot of pressure at times. You kind of always be watching your back, see who's looking at you. One of you guys mentioned this earlier, where you're always kind of thinking about who's looking at you, who's watching you, because you're representing the culture, you're representing everyone. Outside of the LA area, like an hour or two, the Asians just disappear. There's no more. So anywhere outside of there, you're the only one. There are very, very, very few of us. So you definitely have a lot of pressure to kind of represent your culture, represent your race, and not mess it up for everybody, that kind of thing.
If I can quickly jump in, I think that there's that definite pressure, but sometimes, at least in my case, oftentimes I was asked, how do Chinese or Japanese or Koreans, or someone who've never really lived in those countries before, and I felt like I was like a fraud trying to tell them all the stereotypical stuff. And I remember when I say, I have no idea, I've never been there. The entire class was shocked. Even like the professor who was, she was a Chinese, and who came from a family of intellectuals. Her parents were college professors, and she also was my professor. And I was shocked that a Asian American or Chinese American professor was asking me to share with the class about being an Asian person. So I think sometimes there are those funny situations where you're put in places where you look the part, but you really are not the part. And I think that's really about whether it's ignorance or about stereotypes that people have. And I think like everyone has said so far, yeah, we are cognizant as to who is watching, who's hearing what we say. And sometimes I feel like people that look like us are our worst critics, rather than some of the other ones who maybe genuinely really wanted to hear and learn more about things. So
this is just like another anecdote. So I've had two flavors of a similar thing, but moving to LA and being in downtown LA and going to Koreatown, at the checkout line, people would talk to me in Korean, and I'm not Korean, so I don't understand. But I feel like because Los Angeles is so much more diverse. I think they're like, oh, whatever, it's probably another Asian person of a different descent. And then the stark contrast of that, when I would go to the little Asian market in my town in Oklahoma, and the woman would be talking to me in Korean, and then you would feel these waves of disapproval. Like, you are a bad Korean for not speaking Korean. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak Korean. And then her demeanor changed immediately, because it's just like, oh, because you're not Korean, that's okay. But it was, even within the context of being there, you could feel the other flavors of what we're talking about. The AAPI, inter-community racism and ignorance. I think I was like, oh, I'm here to buy some curry blocks. And they were like, you shouldn't buy the Japanese kind. And then she went on a whole thing on like the occupation. And I was like, I'm just here to buy some groceries. And you're here just at the intersection, right? Because it's not only are you in a military town, but you're also here with a Korean woman who likely came here over as a so-called war bride. And I put this in quotations, right? And so there's all these flavors generationally that are coalescing in this moment where if I was just another white person in that store, it would not have happened. But I became an opportunity for this to come up. And I don't think this happens for most people unless you might be a person of color.
Thank you so much for all those comments. So that would be our last question. So at this point, we go around and we have all of the panelists give us 2 minutes to summarize everything that they have heard and said and give their final comments on what's going on. And also when the panel ends, if the panel can hang back for 5 minutes to debrief with me, that'd be great. But please go and say your last 2 minutes closing out, and any way that people can contact you.
I guess I can go. So I guess what I've taken from this is that we're all really different. I know the four of us, again, we all kind of look the same. I think Jorge said this, we all kind of look the same, but even our backgrounds are all really different. I mean, we all grew up in different places. We just had very different experiences, and I think that's what everyone kind of needs to know, is that we're all different, even though we're all Asian, and maybe genetically all four of us might be similar because like just we look kind of similar, but like our experience was so different, like nothing is similar at all, and we all ended up in different places. So I think that's so important to recognize just the differences we are here, and then the different experiences we have. And I think that's that personal touch that we have to get out there somehow, so that people know us as people. Again, all this discrimination, hate crime, everything, it's not new. It's been going on for a long time. I'm glad we're finally able to talk about it. Whatever has been going on that's allowing us to talk about it, that's good. I'm glad we're finally doing something about it on a local and national level. So we're doing well. Again, we need to remember our history for sure. So like definitely hammer that into all the young kids these days. They got to remember the history of where we came from, what we had to struggle through. I think that's super important to kind of continue moving forward.
I guess I can go next. What I've realized, and as I mentioned, what COVID has really underscored for me is that this issue that we're talking about still persists, and it's been around for many generations, and it's affected not just AAPI community, but the African American community, Hispanic community. It's something that is unfortunately in the fabric of society, and we are all different, and we all bring different things to the table. So it's very difficult to come up with like a one-size-fits-all solution to some of these issues that we're talking about. But one of the things that has really been underscored here, we've talked about the individual contacts and the role modeling, I think are vitally important in changing attitudes in society, because what we really have is a problem of perceptions in society that is just really entrenched. It has to be changed almost one contact at a time, and it's going to take a long time, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. And I think these types of forums and bringing it to the forefront and talking about it and putting it out in the open are extremely important.
I think it reminds us all of the power of sort of not only when we're talking about sort of the ethnocentric focus of even though we're minorities in a country, this idea that there is still this overwhelming pull to assimilate or to fit in. And I kind of think about the context of this and what this means, because I feel like even as we're talking now, right, this idea of, you know, having to be that representative, having to make sure that you present the right way, what does that even mean, right? And I feel like so much of our society now is talking about this idea of, do we have to look the way people expect us to look or act the way people expect us to act? Do we not offer something more than just a facade of the way that fits into a specific kind of mold? And I feel like that's, I don't know, it's always going to be, for me, I think personally, this feeling of those things brushing up against one another and forging that identity within those things. And I think the takeaway is sort of just, how can you not be afraid? What are you really afraid of? And that's the part that's scariest, right? Because I mean, it's the same thing we talk about all the time. What's the worst thing that can happen if you have a conversation? Does it mean we have to set our ego aside? Does it mean we have to be uncomfortable? And if that could be an opportunity, imagine what that could bring in terms of just these conversations and having more of these conversations in our day-to-day.
I'm encouraged, and I know that everybody's seen COVID as a very negative experience in our lives, but I also see COVID as a good opportunity for all of us to really get down to the humanity components of who we are and what we share in common. And I think bringing conversations with diverse individuals who are open, I feel encouraged that the idea of having us included in the conversation is really important, whether it's through educating or role model or sharing experiences. I often find we have more in common, even though we come from different perspectives and different places than we always think we do have. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and I am still encouraged, even though we're still dealing with this COVID and some of the challenges that we face, and with all the ugliness that has happened in our country, I think there's always the hope that things could possibly get better.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming to this panel. I have learned a lot. This kicks off our script season, and so next week, the 16th and 17th, we are on. Woohoo! Bright and early. Please go to thescriptconference.com and look at our schedule. And Chief Chow is our keynote speaker. So you have to come back just for that, because what a treat that is going to be, right? And so please go there, thescriptconference.com. If people still want to register, we have some slots left, but we are really, really filling up. So if they want to register, they need to do it now. And don't forget to wear your blue. Put your script background up and share this, but all of this information will be available on our Instagram, which is Script Conference. And you can follow us on Facebook at thescriptconference.com, at the Script Conference. So please do that and share so that people can get this knowledge. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Please hang back, and Captain Young. And we are a wrap until the 16th. Bye all. Thanks for joining us.